Welcome to episode 3 of my Diary of a Self-Healer series. In episode 1 and 2, I discuss some of the red flags I encountered after meeting and marrying a narcissist, and also what not to do after a breakup. In this video, I will explain some of the things I wish I knew before marrying a foreigner. I will not be disclosing any of my ex-husband's personal information, but I will be sharing some general stories and how our differences affected our relationship. Let's start with the first thing that I wish I knew. So this may sound very general, but make sure you know your partner's status regarding their eligibility in your home country. You need to be informed if they're already a citizen, if they're in the process of getting their citizenship. Do they have a green card? Are they here on a visa? And if so, you need to know what type of visa that is, whether it be a work visa, a student visa, tourist visa. So make sure you know what that encompasses. Some foreigners come here as refugees as well, so knowing their status and process getting to your homeland can inform you whether or not they have a specific time limit they must adhere to while in your home country. If they aren't already a citizen, this can affect your lives and the relationship in some way or another. Also, just like with any relationship, you need to know if your partner has a criminal history inside or outside of their home country. This can affect their ability to obtain citizenship or remain in your home country. There are legal steps that you can take to get this information to you, but hopefully you can get this from your partner by simply asking. My second thing that I wish I knew was to make sure you both have shared core values. If you both value different things, your goals will look very different, and the way you treat each other will look very different as well. If two people are in a relationship and they're going in different directions, you'll never see eye to eye. My ex-husband and I didn't discuss important information like this early on in our relationship. In hindsight of us getting married, we realized we had very different values, especially when it came to the qualities we felt were important and the things we prioritized in our lives. He had more superficial values, whereas mine were more grounded in ethics. Our religious views were a bit different, but we did have a couple of similarities. Having a healthy spiritual life was very high on my list, but he didn't really treat this as a priority. He knew the type of lifestyle that he was living conflicted with him being a man of God and what that required. We attended two separate churches for a while. Both of the churches we were attending were very opposite of one another. Some days we'd go to his church and attend there, and then some days we would go to my church and attend. But ultimately, this became pretty straining on our relationship. There were things that happened in my church that didn't resonate with him, and also things that happened at his church that didn't resonate with me. He was also very vocal about criticism towards my church. Eventually, I gave up attending mine and began this new religious journey with him. I tried to be supportive as I could, but I honestly felt like this just wasn't a fit for me. I won't go too deep into detail about what all this church organization encompassed, but it felt like it was a cult. After expressing my concerns to him, he got upset and just asked me to never come back to the church with him, and I honored that request. He also didn't value things like family, teamwork, honesty, and these were some of the things that stood at the forefront of my life. The lesson that I learned from this is when two people have shared values, there's collaboration and less unnecessary stress and conflict centered around what their lives will look like together. Compromise is important, but don't compromise to the point where you're losing yourself and constantly experiencing discomfort. Tip number 3. Know exactly who and what your partner is financially taking care of before you've entered into the picture. A reoccurring issue my ex and I had was that he would constantly send money back home to some of his family members without me knowing. Sending money back home wasn't a huge issue for me, but I emphasized to him the importance of communication. He felt it was none of my business, and because what he sent was in small increments, that it didn't matter. I felt that we needed to take care of our household first before extending our funds to others. This not only threw off our budget, but also he had very poor spending habits. We became the king and queen of paying late fees. I can honestly say that our finances were never in a good place when we were married in this relationship. The lesson I learned is to communicate and make an agreement on where money will and will not go. Money shouldn't go overseas unless it's a joint decision. Also, having a joint account is not a requirement for couples that are married. If one person has very poor spending habits, it's actually better if you guys do separate the funds until there's more discipline over the finances. The next thing that I wish I knew before marrying a foreigner was to get clarity on the type of spouse your partner is expecting. Because we grew up in different countries, we were surrounded by different cultures, which came with different standards for what a wife and husband's role was. He wanted to be very hands-off with any domestic labor in the house and with his kids. Not only was I operating as a single married mom, but I was working full-time just like him. He'd get upset or annoyed when I'd ask him to help out. He'd then bring up how his mom did all the domestic household chores and praised how traditional she was. But he ignored the fact that I was working full-time and that his mom was a stay-at-home housewife. He would need 2 additional jobs on top of the one that he had in order to replace the income that I was making at the time. The US is a very expensive country, and also he could barely keep the job that he had, so I couldn't trust the fact that he could support me and our small family. I was roughly doing about 95% of the work inside of the home, and this honestly had me on the brink of burnout. He had high unexpressed expectations for a housewife that he couldn't afford, and I didn't express my expectations for him either. The lesson that I learned was to have conversations about the expectation for the type of lifestyle you both plan to create together. Figure out if the wife and husband duties will emulate his cultures or yours, or will they surpass these expectations and center around what works for your relationship. The next tip is to have knowledge about your partner's culture, traditions, and their country before you marry them. You have to ask the right questions and observe to know what you're getting yourself into. Also, something important to consider is the type of environment your partner grew up in, and if it exposed them to any trauma. This especially goes for countries that face a lot of war, government corruption, drug-related crimes, and other dangers. My ex-husband grew up around a lot of violence versus me growing up very sheltered, so the way he handled conflict and how he chose his friends reflected a lot of what he'd been through. Also, it's good to know how people in their country feel about your culture. Is it acceptable for them to marry outside of their nationality or race? So sometimes knowing these small details can make a huge difference. The last tip I'm going to share with you is to find out if your partner has a wife or kids back home. This can be a tricky situation because sometimes people are honest with you and sometimes they're not. To an extent, you will need to investigate if you are suspicious at all. Social media is a good source that can unlock some clues to whether or not the person you're dealing with has a hidden life. Luckily, my husband did not have a wife in his home country, but I did have a situation that I talked about in part 1 of my series that I found out, and it did kind of cause a rift in our relationship. It's a lot easier to hide a life or a lifestyle back in your home country because you're not faced to deal with it every day. So you have to be very careful with how you navigate situations like that. I hope that these tips were helpful. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of my Diary of a Self-Healer series. And if you like this content, please like, share, and leave some feedback below. If you made it this far, go ahead and click that subscribe button if you would like to see more videos like this. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.